Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Sirhan on X, a special Saturday night edition coming to you live from Cincinnati, Ohio, in the United States. Actually, a show I wish I didn't have to do the what I'm about to talk about, but given the individual, I think he deserves the accolades, the the celebration, because this guy was just a larger than life icon and global figure, and everybody loved him. It was the sad news today that the world lost the pop culture boxing and icon, Big George Foreman. Passed away at the age of 76. It was announced on his Instagram through his family. Of course, to begin with, it's condolences to him and his family, and of course, all of us in the boxing community who basically loved and admired and adored Big George. I'm just going to touch on his life, his career, and his stature and his place in history because his legacy will never die. His legacy will live on forever. He was basically the American dream. Born out of Marshall, Texas, took up boxing at the early age where he met an individual named Nick Brodus at the Job Corps. Nick Brodus also went by the nickname of Doc, who taught him the ins and outs of the sport of boxing. And he began his amateur career in 1967, where he basically just exploded onto the scene with a first round knockout. And as he basically showed up and just started to use his power and strength to power through the amateur ranks, and as he was able to power himself through the American amateur ranks, he was able to find himself representing the United States in the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, where he powered his way through the Olympic rounds to get to the gold medal round, and basically ended 1968 with a gold medal representing Mexico City as a part of the United States team. And what a way to make a splash in the amateur ranks, basically with just two-fisted power like none other. George Foreman started not only plow through the amateur ranks, it was shortly thereafter where he turned professional. And when he turned professional, he basically picked it off where he left off in the amateurs with this power and his sheer strength and brute force, and just powered his way to the top to amass a massive record of 37-0. And basically, his moment came on January 22nd, 1973, at at Kingston, Jamaica, when he was stated as the number one contender for the then heavyweight champion Joe Frazier. The fight was basically built as the Sunshine Showdown between Foreman and Frazier. Frazier was the champion. Foreman was a number one contender. Frazier, 2 years removed from beating Muhammad Ali, was pegged as a 3-1 favorite simply because of the win of Ali. And even though Foreman was still plowing through opposition, it was debatable if he could do the same to the strong and sturdy Joe Frazier out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And it was on this night where it was Big George Foreman's coming out party that took place in Kingston, Jamaica, where basically one of the scariest and massive one-sided beatings you'll ever see in a heavyweight title fight took place. Basically, from start to the end, it was all George Foreman, where he floored the great Joe Frazier 6 times in 2 rounds to become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. The last punch was an uppercut that lifted a 218-pound man in Joe Frazier off the canvas before the referee, Arthur McCanny, mercifully stopped the fight because the beating was just merciless through those 2 rounds. It was something even George Foreman said until he passed, that he still couldn't believe he did that to the great Joe Frazier. He himself admitted, as we talked about this particular fight with Foreman and Frazier, it was George Foreman who said in the face-off after the weigh-in that he tried to look at Joe Frazier as mean as he possibly could, simply because he realizes and felt his knees were shaking, simply because he didn't realize just how imposing Joe Frazier was, and he didn't want Joe Frazier to know he was nervous. By his own admission, Foreman admitted he was nervous going into this particular fight. Of course, it didn't show when the fight took place because Foreman just steamrolled Frazier, flooring him 6 times in basically less than 4.5 minutes, where the sixth punch and the sixth knockdown was the uppercut that lifted a 215-pound man off the canvas. And basically, George Foreman leaves the ring of Kingston, Jamaica, the heavyweight champion of the world. The crowning achievement at a time when the heavyweight championship of the world was the glamour prize in all of sports. And George Foreman achieved that particular goal. Of course, he would make 2 successful title defenses. One was a 1-round obliteration of a fighter named Jose Roman. After that, a 2-round blast off of Ken Norton, where he basically just drove Norton's head almost through the canvas with a massive uppercut. And he was starting to power his way to the top, and that's where he got. And then the historical event that took place October 30th, 1974 in Kinshasa, Zaire, when George Foreman fought the greatest, Muhammad Ali. A globally pop culture event, not just for sports, but all of entertainment, which changed how entertainment would be viewed forever. You talk about 2 larger-than-life figures going head-to-head at the height of its profession. And when you consider the fact that George Foreman was powering through everyone, and Muhammad Ali, who was still trying to shake off what happened to him with his exile, basically both put together a massive global event, which in terms of global views surpassed over 600 million is how I understood it. But it was a massive bonanza, a massive global bonanza, and that's what Foreman Frazier was. Excuse me, what Ali Foreman was when they fought in this Rumble in the Jungle 50 and a half years ago. Of course, everybody knows the story with this one. It was Ali who would regain his heavyweight championship by stopping Foreman in the 8th round. The particular rope-a-dope where George Foreman, by his own admission, simply said it was a rope-a-dope and I was the dope. And because of his ability to steamroll fighters during the first incarnation of his career, Foreman's mission was not just to win the fight, but much less to destroy and steamroll Muhammad Ali, which is what he did not do in this particular fight. And that was his strategy, and it bit him. It was a case of the particular fight where, as we say in boxing, you take the opponent to the deep waters and see if he can sink or swim. And basically, George Foreman sank that night when the referee, Zach Clayton's count reached 10. Foreman got up, but went to his corner because he was destroying everyone, and he had this monolith of it being invincible. George Foreman thought that was just going to overpower Muhammad Ali on that night, October 30th, 1974 in Kinshasa, Zaire. That didn't happen. And because of it, it sort of messed up George Foreman mentally. Even by his own admission, he said he almost didn't want to take the fight, but because he already fought Frazier and Norton, that's why he went ahead and took it. Of course, he was guaranteed $5 million, which was a part of it, but that's what happened 50 and a half years ago in Kinshasa, Zaire, when George Foreman lost his championship to Muhammad Ali. You know, he overpowered everyone up till this point, but it was Ali who basically brought Foreman down to earth a little bit. And of course, after that, a lot of doubts in the first career of George Foreman started to take place. But he didn't manage to get a movie role in 1975 with Bill Cosby in a movie called Let's Do It Again. Known for his famous quote with Bill Cosby talking about wanting to go see Dancing with Women in New Orleans. It was Foreman that came out of nowhere and said, "What kind of dancing you going to do with those 2 left feet of yours?" And basically, just for comedy's sake, Foreman and Cosby just talking about what they're going to do with those left feet. And then, of course, Foreman said we could just throw it down right now. Cosby basically said, "Let's talk a little bit," and goes over and hugs Big George in a fun comedy movie that took place in 1975 called "Let's Do It Again." Now, the remainder of the Foreman career, the first incarnation, he had the 5 for 5 exhibition after the loss to Ali, which basically was a dud. Muhammad Ali and George Foreman started taunting each other to where, Foreman wanted a rematch. Ali basically told Foreman to go earn it. But his first real fight after the Ali loss took place January 24th, 1976. And boy, was it a kadoozy. It was his fight with Ron Lyle, the 1976 fight of the year, where both fighters tasted the deck each time. Foreman felt Lyle's power and vice versa till the 5th round when George Foreman just stepped a foot on the gas and just pounded Lyle into the corner to where Lyle was on the canvas and could not beat the count. Foreman pretty much regained his stature as a scary individual with that brutal punching power. And of course was calling for a rematch with Muhammad Ali. Months later, he would get a rematch with Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden for a North American Championship, where basically Foreman was trying to get another title shot at Ali. The rematch, basically the same thing as the first fight. Joe Frazier just fights in survival mode the first 2 rounds, and Foreman just pounds him from rounds 3 to 5 to where basically the fight was mercifully stopped, and Foreman was the winner, started to lay another beating. But in the final test to become the contender for Ali's title and the rematch he had been looking for, George Foreman met the slick Jimmy Young in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and basically was nowhere to be found, was given a boxing lesson by Young, where Young wins the unanimous decision. And George Foreman, after that fight, basically in his corner says he found religion, and that's where he took the retirement at the time. Of course, it was the 10-year retirement that Foreman became a preacher, a minister with the churches, using his newfound religion to spread the word in his hometown of Houston, Texas. Also eventually built the George Foreman Youth Center to help kids and young adults off the streets and show them the ropes when it comes to boxing. And basically it was a wonderful thing he did there in Houston, Texas, until the year of 1987, when even though Foreman was doing well outside of the ring, he made the decision to come back, and it was greeted with mocking laughter simply because the last images of George Foreman was still what happened in the Rumble in the Jungle to Muhammad Ali 50 and a half years ago. And he comes back against a journeyman named Steve Zalski, gets a 4th round stoppage, and basically a fight that was just a grotesque mismatch. But when Foreman came back in a second incarnation from 1987 on, he essentially hit the reset button, basically just critiquing his career almost from scratch, from the ground up, started to get wins and started to gain momentum. And instead of being the fierce, ferocious, standoffish human being he was in the first incarnation, now Foreman is that jolly old human being, the loving bald head guy who's just a loving fat man, comes back and is starting to build his record in the second career. And then in 1990, he started to really make his way in a fight that was called the Two Geezers at Caesars. He fights a well-known title challenger named Jerry Cooney, known for losing a title fight to Larry Holmes in 82, which had a crazy amount of people covering the fight in press row. I mean, more people were covering this fight than the Hagler-Hearns Wild Showdown in 85. And Foreman just obliterated Jerry Cooney in 2 rounds. And basically a fight where after the first round, looked like Cooney was going to be the one to win. A long jab and a right uppercut, and Cooney was out of it. Foreman unloaded for the first knockdown. And of course, the second knockdown was a left uppercut and the right cross. and Cooney was down and out, fell on like a telephone pole that just crashed onto the road. That's what George Foreman did to Jerry Cooney. And now people were just beginning to take Foreman's comeback seriously. 5 months later, on a double bill on HBO with Mike Tyson, he fights his first top 10 opponent named Jose Adelson Rodriguez, who is ranked in the top 10 in all the major governing bodies. Foreman obliterates him in less than 2 rounds and is now positioning himself for a title shot. Also trying to position himself for that big payday with Mike Tyson. As people know, at that point, Mike Tyson was a cash cow that everybody wanted. It was George Foreman's target to get Mike Tyson at some point when he came back. Now, of course, Mike Tyson lost to Buster Douglas, and many things changed. So now, as he's starting to gain steam, he finally gets the title shot he's looked for the longest time. It was April 19, 1991, known as the Battle of the Ages. He fights the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, Evander Holyfield. The undefeated fighter at age 28, Foreman coming at 42, who hadn't lost in a second incarnation, 22-0 with 21 knockouts going in, rated amongst the top 10 in the governing bodies. And even though he did lose the fight simply because Holyfield was just a more active fighter, George Foreman's will, persistence, and courage won the hearts of everybody, won the hearts of the fight fans and the entertainment public and the world public, as he found a way to survive the 12 rounds in a fight where most people thought Evander Holyfield was going to get some form of a stoppage on him. That wasn't to be. Foreman had his moments. Actually, Evander Holyfield, who was on Mike Tyson's podcast several years back, said the hardest puncher he fought was George Foreman, that he felt at one point when Foreman hit him, he had to ask his trainers if his teeth were still there, because that was how hard of a punch George Foreman had, and that's how Evander Holyfield felt it in that particular fight. Said Holyfield got the decision, but Foreman basically won the night in the sense that he captured the hearts of fight fans worldwide, being a 42-year-old fighter, not just a fighter with a name or a past, but a fighter who actually validated his comeback as something of significance with this particular performance. Fast forward a few fights later, he fights Tommy Morrison for a fringe heavyweight championship after putting together a 3-fight winning streak. This fight, basically, Foreman, for the first time in his second career, actually showed his age, because Morrison wouldn't give him the opportunity to sit there and hit him. Basically just box his way to a unanimous decision win. Again, George had his moments also, but the real story of this one was Morrison just didn't let Foreman get off. But even then, the public still was just enamored by what George Foreman did. Now, after we go back to the Holyfield loss, that's where everyone really fell in love with Foreman. He went up getting the commentator gig as an expert analyst on HBO's World Championship Boxing with Jim Lampley and Larry Merchant. You know, all kinds of stuff with those three. And as Foreman continued his broadcasting career, he was still continuing his comeback. Then came a night of April 22nd, 1994, when Evander Holyfield fought Michael Moore for the first time at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas. Calling the fight at ringside for that night for HBO, actually also then was known as TVKO, was, of course, Big George Foreman. Back then, it was basically Foreman just calling a fight, basically calling turned out to be Michael Moore's win over Evander Holyfield, which propelled Moore to the heavyweight title and the heavyweight champion of the world. But little did we know that when Foreman was calling this fight, he had a special interest in this because he was watching Michael Moore closely as he was winning this championship. After the first Moore-Holyfield fight where Moore was declared the winner, it was revealed that promoter Bob Arum said that George Foreman called Arum within the first 2 days after that fight. And Bob Arum basically said, "Don't even kid me. You want the Michael Moore fight." And George Foreman basically told Bob Arum, by any means necessary, get me this fight. Because if I get him, I'm going to do it. Fight was set for November 5th, 1994. As I honor Foreman, I have this here. One for the ages. It packed 19,000 at the MGM Grand Garden in Las Vegas. About 18.8 was going to cheer for big George Foreman because George Foreman just found a way to dazzle the public and have the public love in his hearts. Everywhere he goes, you always hear the chants of George, George, George. The odds for this one were barely under 2-1, but the remote feeling was whether or not George Foreman had more than a puncher's chance. He was telling people, especially HBO's Jim Lampley, for the longest time, Michael Moore is going to make a mistake. He's going to stand in front of me. And then what happens? I'm going to put him down and I'm going to put him out. For a minute, it didn't look like it was going to happen because Michael Moore was just basically doing anything and everything he wanted to for the better half of the first half of the fight. I mean, Foreman's eyes were swollen and Michael Moore was just peppering him with 1-2s and right hooks out of the southpaw stance. But as the fight was going on, George Foreman was still standing despite all of it. George Foreman started to find home for those lethal 1-2s that had been his bread and butter in his second career after the 10-year hiatus. And the 8th round looked like he was going to do it because for that brief moment, he did hurt Michael Moore. But Michael Moore came back to win rounds 8 and 9 rather big. But in round 10, everything changed. George Foreman just simply let his hands go. Basically, 1-2s, 1-2s. Michael Moore was hurt. And then 2 left hooks to Michael Moore, where Moore started to lean on George Foreman. And Foreman started to find his rhythm and started to find his punch. Subtle move where Foreman swings and misses with the left hook badly. Michael Moore stands right in front of George Foreman. The first 1-2 doesn't do anything except just keeps Michael Moore as a sitting target. And as George Foreman eloquently said, that punch was a little high. So what am I going to do? I'm going to lower that right hand a little bit. It lowered more than just the right hand. The right hand lowered onto Michael Moore's chin, and that lowered Michael Moore to the canvas. Joe Cortez, the referee, reaches a count of 10. And as Jim Lampley said that night, it happened. In the second incarnation of his career, 30 and a half years ago at the MGM Grand Garden in Las Vegas, in front of a packed house, standing room only 19,000, George Foreman regains the heavyweight championship of the world. Let me remind you, he regained this title 20 years and 6 days after losing it to Muhammad Ali in Kinshasa, Zaire. And that moment was just haunting Foreman for the longest time. But it came full circle 30 and a half years ago at the MGM Grand Garden, 20 years, 6 days after losing to Ali, as George Foreman became the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. And that was basically the pinnacle of Foreman's comeback. And the comeback that everybody called a laughter, everyone called whatever, everything of the book, made fun of it, made a mockery out of it. At the end, George Foreman had the last laugh. I said all along during his comeback, when I used to follow this and do this sort of thing, one thing you could have never done, nobody could ever beat the belief out of George Foreman in his second career. He always believed in himself. He always was driven to prove the doubters wrong. He was driven to become the heavyweight champion of the world. And 30 and a half years ago at the MGM Grand Garden in Las Vegas, November 5th, 1994, exactly 20 years and 6 days after he lost to Ali, George Foreman achieved that goal. And as Jim Lampley said, it happened. It happened. Because nobody saw him doing this. But he told Jim Lampley several times, Michael Moore was going to make a mistake, and when he makes a mistake, he's going to pay. That's what George Foreman did. Michael Moore made the mistake of sitting in front of him. The first 1-2 high on the head, stunned Moore for the minute. George Foreman says he's going to lower the right hand. The right hand, the 1-2 on the point of Michael Moore's chin, which he lowered that punch and he lured Michael Moore down and out for the count, and history was made. And that was the conclusion of the peak of the second career of George Foreman. You don't see athletes or anybody of that any walk of life can say they did it and had two successful careers in the same profession the way George Foreman did. When he came back in 1987 after the 10-year hiatus, a lot of people basically told him, don't do it. You're going to get hurt. It's a young man's sport. Leave it be. People thought he was coming back for the money, which by his own admission, he said he did to help out the George Foreman Youth Center he built in Houston, Texas. Came back with a consumer-friendly image, all kinds of commercials. And when it captivated November 5th, 1994, when the 1-2 splatted Michael Moore in the back, the arms and legs spread, splat on your back position, down and out for the count. And that's when George Foreman achieved his goal. You could never beat the belief out of George Foreman. You could have said anything you wanted about the comeback at the time. He wasn't going to listen. He was driven to prove the doubters wrong. And he did it when he splatted Michael Moore that night. And of course, it spawned off to more endorsements eventually down the line. The commercials he had with Meineke, by George, I think he's got it. Of course, he had one with Pepsi, Doritos, and eventually, of course, the biggest fad of them all, the George Foreman Grill, which at one point he banked, at one point, I believe, like somewhere around $250 million. And I believe after all kinds of investments and all kinds of financial, I guess, additions, turned out he pocketed $720 million off that grill because the company let him have the rights to it, and basically Foreman turned it into a global phenomenon. Basically, it's still a global phenomenon. You can still buy it on Amazon globally, and it's still one of the big hip things maybe ever. And you could probably call it the biggest fight purse in boxing history, given what the endorsement deals George Foreman got out of it. Now, of course, he would continue on his career, having fought 3 more times: Axel Schultz, Lou Savarese, and Shannon Briggs, going 2-1, although everybody knows what happened with the Shannon Briggs fight. And basically, after the Briggs fight, Foreman basically said, I'm not going to fight again. And that's what happened. Continued his broadcasting career with HBO until 2004. Actually did some broadcasting with Top Rank TV for a while. Still does this thing with the church. Was a philanthropist for the longest time, an entrepreneur. Also, not too long ago, there was the movie biopic about him, and he had a recent interview with the former NFL standouts Deshaun Jackson and Brandon Marshall, talking about his career, his friendship with Muhammad Ali after their fight October 30th, 1974. And you can almost see the glow in the eyes of Marshall and Jackson when you heard the George Foreman story. Was a car collector at one point till he had no use for him, eventually sold them. Had a bunch of books out, basically titled by, biggest one, of course, is By George. Had multiple kids with the same name of George. And you could go on and on about what this guy did. I mean, fighter, Olympic gold medal winner, 2-time heavyweight champion of the world, International Boxing Hall of Fame nominee in 2003. The salesman, the genuine, kind-hearted human being in the second incarnation from what he was the first time, where he was just a scary individual nobody wanted to talk to. Became a author, a philanthropist, preacher, minister. Of course, the grill. There was nothing George Foreman couldn't do. And he basically lived the American dream. His words, and even during his second comeback, was basically, doesn't matter how old you are, nothing's a death sentence. As long as you put your heart and mind to it, you can do anything. And that's what George Foreman did. Especially that's how he built up the Michael Moore fight, when basically he wanted to said, and I quote, I just want to show the world at age 45 and 55 is not a death sentence. We can do anything we want to do. And you can almost hear the roar of the crowd. and basically how he sold not just the Moore fight, but sold his second career basically in that fashion, captured the hearts of everybody, not just in the States, but globally, and became a pop culture global icon in that regard. I mean, he even had a cartoon at one point called Food Fighter. It was his voice that was in it. So to tell you about the impact and the lasting legacy of George Foreman. And, and we talk about, for my fight followers, his place in heavyweight history. It's a no-brainer. The guy's a top 6 all-time great heavyweight. You could argue his second career and when he won the title from Moore elevated him to a top 6 or top 7 status because it was still known for what happened with the rope-a-dope. He was a dope by his quote in regards to the loss to Ali, or the demolition he did to Joe Frazier January 22nd, 1973 in Kingston, Jamaica. But maybe when he pasted Michael Moore in the splat position to win the heavyweight championship of the world, you could argue it almost re-elevated his stature among the all-time great heavyweights. I mean, in my opinion, if I had a ranking, he'd probably be somewhere in my top 7. I mean, just the fact he did it a second time and had a second incarnation of what he did the first time more or less enhanced his legacy as a fighter. And we know what happened after that. So his legacy is second to none in and out of the ring. I mean, it's all out there, what he did. It was just an overall sad day when I had to wake up to the news that the world lost one of the ultra premier, not just boxing icons, but you could probably argue a pop culture icon and probably a real-time, real-life celebrity makeover from what he was in his first incarnation to a second incarnation. The first time, of course, was the big 70s style R&B type afro, where he was just this mean guy looking to scare people, just going out there, pounding you down and beating you up all over the place. Till the 10 years out. And then when he came back after the 10 years out, became the lovable, cuddly, just one-of-a-kind figure that everybody loved and that captured the hearts of, not just the boxing public, but the sports public and all of the hearts of American people all over the place when his second career took place. And there's a sad day. There's a tough loss. Maybe a couple things I'll add before I wrap this up in regards to Foreman. Let me try to word this correctly. It goes to show you, as long as you have a belief, you can do it. You can do it. Because George Foreman basically showed it in his second incarnation of his career. I mean, to say you had 2 careers in the same profession, taking off 10 years in the middle, where basically doing is just preaching off a Bible or opening up youth centers and just telling stories, and to simply come back to do it a second time basically validated it. His legacy, his stature, not just in boxing, but in all of sports and in all of culture as it is, signed, stamped, sealed, delivered, nothing's going to top it. I mean, no one's going to anoint him as the greatest ever. I mean, but as I said, in your heavyweight rankings, definitely in the top 7. In terms of just the pure raw puncher, especially at a time when pure punchers in the heavyweight division were just brutal. You talk about just pure, load up the bare fist, punch a hole through a big wall while you don't do damage to your hand. That was George Foreman. Probably could argue the most brutal puncher and the most scary individual to ever step foot in the boxing ring. But he made himself over to become this lovable guy, a tremendous human being out of the ring. And of course, they all loved him. Jim Lampley, Larry Merchant, when he called the fights on HBO with them. Of course, later on, he went to the top-ranked television, the closed circuit version of their fights to do top-ranked TV. Of course, there's the biopic of him that came out, I think it was like a couple years ago. I mean, is there anything George Foreman couldn't do? I mean, that's basically his legacy. And you can, his fight legacy is stamped and sealed, delivered. And it's just an overall sad day when we have to say goodbye to one of the all-time greats in the ring and just one of the all-time great personalities, and maybe an all-time, you want to call it this, total celebrity makeover from what he was in part 1 to part 2. Right now, at the gates of heaven, they're billing the rematch between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. A star-studded audience like none other. George Foreman, thank you for your service out here. We all love you. And that'll wrap up this special edition of Sir Hunt on X. I hope everyone has themselves a wonderful day. Always, always make self-care your number one priority. I will be back Monday night. But until then, have yourselves a wonderful rest of the weekend. Take care of yourselves. God bless. Rest in peace, George Foreman. Rest in paradise. The pearly gates are loving you right now.